I remember one of the most powerful moments for me in the last decade was in the immediate aftermath of the 2016 election. We have built this really beautiful and actually very thick set of relationships in Los Angeles, multi-faith, multiracial relationships. And after the election of 2016, we came together in the Islamic Center of Southern California. And we gathered together to talk about what was likely to be the threats that would come down to all impacted communities in the course of the now incoming administration. And actually, the room was mostly filled with Latino pastors, interestingly. And someone got up, a representative from the Islamic Center, and said the following, said, "I want to speak right now to my Latino brothers and sisters. When they come for you, they're coming for all of us. We reach out to you now with arms of loving embrace." And I remember bursting into tears because I thought, wow, it's true. Latinos are on the front lines in this new administration, or we think they will be. But Muslims aren't so far behind. I mean, he'd already made very clear how he felt about, how he would feel about the folks that are in the Islamic Center every Friday. And so I was so stunned by it. And I thought that is what solidarity looks like. It's not that I'm totally safe and okay, so how can I, out of the generosity of my heart, be a good ally? It's that we are all in this together. And I believe that you are absolutely right. We have got to get this resolved, and we have to get it resolved immediately. We have to find our way to one another because we have between our communities many shared interests. And we also have the people who have the most interest in us fighting with one another, who you have already named, pose an incredible danger and threat to all of us. And couldn't be happier to see the Jews and the issue of anti-Semitism being used as the wedge to break apart the left, which is the way, frankly, Waj, that anti-Semitism has historically been used. Anti-Semitism is not part of the natural world. It is not a rising tide of anti-Semitism. It is a machinery that throughout history is used by people who want to drive wedges in movements for justice. We've learned this throughout history. We saw it happen in the immediate aftermath of the Women's March. Who were the people who were driving that attempt to break the coalition that was responding to the 2016 elections? It's the same people now who are, creating bots that are making people, crazy on social media.
I think you could see what happened with Claudine Gay, the fissure with Black communities and Jewish communities. It worked like just gangbusters.
It's very painful. And there are some real bad actors who are in this place who are not bots and who are, and who are not white nationalists. But there are also people who are benefiting from this fissure. And it's extremely dangerous for all of us. And so this is why I think the most essential and important thing that we can be doing right now is actually, if we can, because let me just take a moment. A lot of people are asking me these last few months, do you give up on your vision as a universalist now? And is it okay for us to just retreat to tribalism? And didn't October 7th prove that the world doesn't care if Jews live or die? And my response is, when we are grieving, when we are in the deepest grief, and here I can say to the Jewish community, because as we understand more about what actually happened on October 7th, we are in deep sorrow and grief. And I can say to the Palestinian community, witnessing day after day the incredible, devastating loss of human life, when we are in deep sorrow because our families are under attack, it's very hard to reach across the divide and find our way to each other. But we can't, and when we're grieving in the Jewish tradition, we go into Shiva in the aftermath of the death of a loved one. We go into the house of mourning, and nobody goes into that house of mourning who's not a friend. We are surrounded by love. And that is exactly what our hearts need. We are fed by love. We are clothed, but everyone takes care of us. But you can't stay in Shiva forever. At some point, you have to get up and walk around the block. And when we walk around the block at the end of that most intense period, we realize, hey, I'm not the only one who's hurting here. And I'm not the only one who also has love and who also has dreams here. And so the question is for you and for me and for all of our friends and all of our former allies, right? Can we step out of our shiva, out of our deepest mourning, and actually see that we're all hurting right now? And the only liberation will be a collective liberation. There is no other answer to this. The only way to build a future is going to be to build a future together. And Israelis and Palestinians, I think, and I hope, and I trust, are going to be figuring that out themselves, led by some of the folks that I mentioned earlier. But can you and I figure that out here? Can we continue to find our way to one another with compassion and with curiosity? Because again, I hear Hannah Arendt's voice warning us, tyranny benefits when we are alienated from one another. That's the only way that they win, is when we don't see each other as on the same side of history.
Looking on the outside, I was so disturbed by reading some posts, especially in the Jerusalem Post and essays, where the Jewish writers looked at Jews who were asking for a ceasefire or quote unquote pro-Palestinian as quote un-Jews, an excommunication of Jews, right? Takfiring, as we say in Arabic. And as a Muslim, I was like, Jews, don't do this. Don't do this, Jews. Learn from us. This is terrible. This is not going to help you. And, with Muslims, there's a joke with the person that you also know. I won't mention him. He said, like, what do you admire about Jews? I'm like, oh, the fact that they're this beleaguered, oppressed minority and they achieve so much success and influence in America. That's like a role model for the rest of us. I'm like, what do you admire about Muslims? He thought about it. He goes, your numbers. And so I was like, okay, I'll take it. The bar is low. But we have 1.7 billion, all right? Not too many Jews. They're like 17, 18 million. And I'm looking at this, and I'm looking at the fissures. We've talked about Jews versus progressives, and Jews and Black people, and Jews and Palestinians, and Jews and the youth. Within Jewish communities, I look at these fissures, and I'm like, Jews, this ain't good for you, especially with the threat that I was talking about. So I'm going to ask you to put on your rabbi kippah, rabbi hat. How do you heal these fissures within Jewish American communities, especially with the youth, where it's a total game changer moment?
Right. You are so right. This is a huge issue right now. And I spoke to Ezra Klein a couple of months ago, shortly after October 7th, and it was an incredible conversation. He gave an introduction. I don't know if you heard the episode yet, but he gave an introduction that I thought was so wise and profound to help people understand what's going on intergenerationally right now in the Jewish community. To paint a broad brush, because by the way, my kids aren't following this trend. So it's certainly it's not universal, but there is a trend. We have to notice it, that essentially my parents and grandparents' generation saw Israel as, a place to take in refugees, a David to the Goliath of the Arab world, desperate to fight for our own existence and in the ever present hope of peace. My generation essentially got acculturated to an idea of Israel now of strength, in the Israel of the 90s, of the Oslo Accords, which is when I started spending time in Israel, an Israel that had power and had strength and was engaged in an occupation and desperate to end it, desperate to make peace, desperate to figure out how we could help strengthen the Palestinian leadership so there could be a possibility of a two-state solution so both people could live in peace side by side with safety, security, and self-determination. Our children's generation grew up in a world in which Israel was strong and powerful, and there was an occupation now significantly more entrenched than when I was there in the 90s, and not striving for peace. That's the major narrative of the last 20 years under this increasingly hardline and rightward turning government. And so that's why so many young Jews today look at Israel and say, you're not even trying. What's going on? Now, the fact is that over the last year, since Israel's most hardline, ultra-nationalist, messianic government came into power, the people of Israel woke up and took to the streets, hundreds of thousands of them, week after week, day after day, saying, this isn't who we are. This isn't our grandparents' dream. It was an awakening similar to the awakening under the Trump administration of many Americans who said, I've always been upset about this, but I've never taken to the streets before. Now I have to fight for it. And so many people were starting to have real movement on this. Then October 7th happened. And that Shabbat, that Saturday night, was the first Saturday night in 10 months when there weren't massive protests against the government. Because people were reeling from the atrocities that happened that morning. They're coming back to the streets now, Waj. Like, people are back on the streets calling for this government to be dismantled, calling for a new election, declaring that we must have a just peace, we must have a democracy. But those are our allies in this struggle. Those are the people whose voices I, need to amplify. But I understand why generationally young Jews are experiencing this very differently than the way that I experienced it and the way that my parents experienced it. The answer to this dilemma is that we actually have to meet each other on the core values. I think when young Jews are crying out about how upset they are about what's happening in Israel, I think that we have to honor that they're seeing their incredibly tragic loss of human life, and they're expressing a yearning for a different kind of future. And I share both that sorrow over the loss of Palestinian lives, and I share a dream that we have to begin to envision a different kind of future, and then we have to do everything we can to support it. So I would use different language, I would use different strategy, but I definitely understand where these young Jews are coming from. At the same time, I also understand where the older Jews are coming from when they say, do you understand anything about history? And here I'm going to say something a little controversial, which is whenever I speak with Palestinian friends and they talk to me about their yearning for home, about their sense of abandonment by the world, about their desperation for self-determination, I always think there is a people in the world who are very well suited to understand those things because we share those human experiences, a yearning for home, a sense that we've been abandoned by the world, a fierce hunger for self-determination, which is why the state of Israel was born in the first place. Can we meet there? Can we start the conversation there? When one side delegitimizes the other from the outset, there's not much room for conversation, but can we not find our way to one another as human beings who share a yearning for a life that is safe and dignified and peaceful, where we and our children can have a future?